Hi everybody and welcome to Fraudible, the video podcast that brings together academics and practitioners to discuss all things fraud. In this episode we're going to be discussing the policing of fraud, and I'm delighted to be joined by academic Professor Mark Button and practitioner Tammy Barnes. And thank you very much for joining me, both of you. Mark, would you mind giving us a brief introduction into you and your work, please?
So I'm Professor Mark Button from Portsmouth University. I'm co-director of the Centre for Cybercrime and Economic Crime, and I've done lots of research over the years into fraud-related issues.
Thank you. And Tammy?
Yeah, my name's Tammy Barnes. I'm a Protect Officer for Derbyshire Police. I've been in this role for around 8 years now. The majority of my days are spent working with victims of fraud. The type of fraud, can range from anything from romance fraud to push payment scams, things like that. So, yeah, we work a lot with victims.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So, and Tammy, you've been in that role for 8 years. So what's changed during that time?
I suppose sometimes we say that actually the fraud itself doesn't really change, although technology has left us more vulnerable to different types of scams. I suppose they reinvent themselves. So, the post office delivery scams that we're seeing now, where people are clicking links and submitting details, are the same as the COVID scams that we saw, during the pandemic, when it was about getting your vaccinations or your PPE. The mechanics of it are the same. What the fraudster does, though, is almost just reinvents the sort of branding of the scam so that people can be tricked time and time again.
Do you find that the way that the victims respond to the frauds has also changed over time? Is the sort of stereotypical feeling of shame still there that it always has been, or has that changed over time?
No, I think people really tend to be embarrassed. They feel a sense of guilt, a burden if they've, parted with large sums of money. I suppose the reason why scams are so successful is that I suppose fraudsters have learnt from previous mistakes. So their language might have been quite poorly written, or the graphics on a letter may not have been as clear, and they've slickened their processes up, I suppose. So people feel foolish when they've become victim because they haven't spotted it. But they are so good at what they do. It is heartbreaking working with these victims who, through no fault of their own, probably too trusting. That's not a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. So, but yeah, definitely, we often use the terms no shame and no blame, but that is not how a victim feels. They often don't want to speak to their family, they don't want to speak to their friends, and they carry this burden, and it weighs them down and it takes over every aspect of their life.
Any thoughts on that, Mark?
Well, yeah, I would agree. I mean, I've done several studies where I've interviewed large numbers of victims from a wide range of different kinds of frauds, and as Tammy says, the kind of impact on some can be very significant. It can be sort of life-changing, sometimes even suicide, or certainly attempted suicide. But lots of emotional and psychological impacts, and embarrassment, and sometimes negative changes in behaviour, in the sense that they don't want to go out or to go online, and that might be something that was quite crucial to their lives. So I think there is that problem. I do think there still is a problem with individuals blaming the victims as well. If I could get £1 for every time someone said to me, how stupid could they have been to kind of fall for that. I'd be an incredibly rich person. And we should be focusing our attention on the fraudsters. It's them doing the bad things, not on the victims, because there is a scam for everyone. You know, everyone has a weakness, and obviously the fraudsters are good at finding the people with the right weaknesses that they can exploit.
Tammy, any thoughts on that?
Agree completely, especially about the behaviours and the way people change. You know, there's so many people that we work with that were already slightly isolated, you know, and then, you know, find themselves even more isolated because through the shame or the guilt, they may withdraw even from family in the fear of them falling out, sort of finding out. And how family would judge them. So many people I speak to, I'll say, you know, why don't we tell your family? Or, you know, I'm happy to be with you. I can talk to family. No, I can't have them find out. You must promise me you won't tell them. And I feel so sad for these people because it is just this huge weight. And like Mark also said, you know, they start to withdraw from technology, you know. So many people I go and visit, you know, they no longer want to answer the phone. And that phone is their lifeline. You know, they've been, you know, trusting enough to talk to somebody on the phone, and that person has manipulated them and exploited them. So they don't know who to trust. And that's a really sad place to be for somebody who doesn't even they feel like a prisoner in their own home.
How do you find then that the victims respond to you and your colleagues in the force? Because I can sort of estimate that people who have been coerced into being a victim of fraud might not want to trust people full stop. So then if they have a police officer turn up and they want and to talk to them about the fraud and get to understand the details, and do you find that they're usually fairly trusting, or do you find that they're not really wanting to divulge even to yourself?
I think sometimes it depends on the type of fraud. I really do. Romance fraud victims are a lot harder to to break down almost. But what I find is a lot of the people I work with, you know, we introduce ourselves, we explain why we're coming, you know, and they can be very responsive, actually. I think a lot of people sort of paint the police in quite a negative way these days, and you know, they'll have their reasons. But when it comes to fraud, you know, we try and work with the majority of the victims that we hear about that come, and they are really surprised in a positive way of the attention, the amount of information we can give to them, the support, because it's not just us as the police who can provide that support. You know, we can link in with their banks, we can link in with social care, we can touch base with family. There are so many avenues that we can go down, and I think especially the elderly are so grateful, and you'll quite often hear from them and say, thank you so much, I can't believe you've come to visit me and spent this time with me when you could be out there doing real police work. Well, for me, this is real police work. We are protecting people when they need us most.
And I think that sort of links to them just feeling that their crime was so insignificant, supposedly, compared to what other crime is out there. So they're almost trying to label their case as unimportant compared to everything else, which I guess comes with the package almost of, I've been stupid, I've done this, I shouldn't have done.
I think you're absolutely right there, how you've sort of worded that, to say that they feel like theirs is not important in the grand scale of things. But we all know that fraud is extremely underreported, and it's more than 41% of all crime reported. So if we look at the figures, it's really important.
Mark, have you done any research that has included you needing to interview police officers specifically in the fraud space?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, lots of projects that we've done have involved talking to police officers. There's just so many, so I don't know where to start, Claire. You know, going back to obviously that very first study I did on fraud victims for the old National Fraud Authority, we talked to other police officers then. Fast forward to the current project I'm working on for the Home Office, which is looking at the kind of fraudsters based in Nigeria, Ghana and India, and we're kind of talking to police officers there as well, not only in this country, but in their countries as well. So, you know, lots of projects in between. So, obviously police who work in this area are a very useful source of information.
And do you find that there are differences in the amount of detail that they're willing to go into if you interview police officers overseas and compared to in Britain? Is there like a different policing culture, which sort of,
Yes, absolutely. So I would say definitely in this current project, Nigerian police officers are very open. Ghanese police officers are very open.
Okay.
Indian police officers are very open. They'll talk to you, you know, all kinds of things. Whereas British police are very much focused on what is your security clearance? Can I tell you that? I don't have any additional security clearance, and that's in some ways an advantage because obviously if you do have security clearance, they start telling you things, but you can't actually put those in the public domain, but you can't remember which things, you know, you could say and which aren't. You know, that obviously gets more challenging. I can understand why they're like that, but just to give you some examples, in the current project, I've been talking to scam baiters, and scam baiters use all kinds of techniques to get inside fraudster groups, and scam baiters are very happy to tell you lots of information, which I'm sure the police are doing similar types of things, but obviously they were never going to tell you that. So on certain things, I think the police can be very useful, but I think on a project like the one at the moment, certainly in the UK context, they're very kind of constrained by kind of the information they can put into the public domain.
Tammy, stop being constrained. Have you found, and Tammy, that if you've worked with police forces overseas, and do you find them easy to work with on the whole? Are there complications because of the international side of things? Because that's obviously an issue in the fraud space in general, with regards to law enforcement and accountability, that sort of thing. So have you had experience of that?
I think this is where, so my role personally as a protect officer. So I only get involved in sort of the initial scoping side of a job. So when I come in contact with a victim, my focus is on them as an individual. What can I do to help them? I do work alongside some of the detectives, but this is where fraud becomes really quite difficult in the sense that the way we investigate fraud. So, for example, and I always try to explain this to a victim, if you are assaulted in Derbyshire will look into that crime because the offender, the victim, and the crime all happened or all were present in Derbyshire at the time. When it comes to fraud, it is very, very different. As you know, that we look for lines of inquiry to enable us to house an offender. And quite often, just because we have a victim in Derbyshire, it doesn't mean to say that offence actually took place in Derbyshire. And what we would end up is with, for every victim we have in Derbyshire, we know they will be in Leicester, they will be in Nottingham, they'll be in Manchester. So we could actually throw all of our resources at that, but we'd all be investigating exactly the same thing. So once we have to look for viable lines of inquiry to run an investigation. And, there's a number of things. It could be telephones, it could be, following the money and things like that. Once that money actually leaves the country, an investigation becomes very difficult. I personally have no contact with, any sort of law enforcement outside of the UK. So it's not something that I can sort of comment on, but I know that it is very, very difficult. And quite often fraud is not always investigated the way a victim would want it to be, simply because there's no real investigation to be had, even in Derbyshire stroke or the UK. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess also following on from that is that the resourcing from the police is put into wherever the priority is at the time, I imagine, because it's very politically sort of directed. So because at the moment in government, fraud is such a massive topic at the moment, and so you see and hear that police forces are now sort of being allocated more into those sorts of crimes. But do you then find that once that stops, then people lose faith in the police, in the fraud space specifically? But that's purely because it's not being publicised as much. It isn't so in the public eye.
I think for the majority of victims that I work with, they want us to investigate. They want. These people have stolen their self-esteem, they have stolen their confidence, and they've stolen their hard-earned money, and they want something done about it. And quite rightly so, and that is why when I work with my victims, I'm very honest, and I like to explain how investigations are had and carried out. But that's why here in Derbyshire, we sort of changed our tact a little bit, because what people want from me is their money back. They want to know how come they were let down. Why was there not things in place that would have made, that could have prevented this from happening. So we work with victims in a number of ways. So, and we do look at finding ways to recover money. For victims in Derbyshire, since lockdown, we've managed to, have over 7 million reimbursed to our victims.
Wow.
And although that goes a long way to, making a victim feel better, if for want of a matter, it doesn't make the crime go away, and it doesn't change the fact that for every door we close for a fraudster, they'll just open 5 more, but yeah, I do think that people think the police do nothing about fraud, but I don't think the general public understand how big a problem it is.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Mark?
Well, I think first of all, not enough resources is dedicated to policing fraud. And we know that 40% of crime against individuals is fraud. Now, I'm not suggesting that we have 40% of police resources dedicated to fraud, but we probably only have less than 2% of resources. So there's a bit of a mismatch there. And I think, there should be much more done. I mean, one of the things that's coming out of this project at the moment is that obviously we have a significant amount of fraud that involves an international element. The Home Office estimates about 70%. We have large numbers of fraudsters based in West Africa and India targeting this country essentially with impunity, because they know they're not going to be brought to justice. Now, the Americans, obviously, a kind of pin drop in terms of the scale of fraud, but the Americans do go to these countries and extradite fraudsters. And obviously they have very large sentences waiting for those fraudsters when they get them back to America. And that must concentrate the minds of some fraudsters to think that, I could end up being extradited to America and, spend 30 years in jail. We and, most other Western countries, Australia, Canada, Western Europe, don't really do that. Now, it's obviously labour intensive, and that's one of the reasons why we don't do it, and obviously we've got scarce resources, but I think we should do some. And I think we should also look at lesser options like sanctions. You watch Jim Browning on YouTube. He essentially hacks into the scam call centres in India. He identifies who these fraudsters are. It can be done. Obviously he's ultimately using unlawful means in India, but you could justify it's justifiable because they're committing crimes. Well, even if we can't prosecute those people that can be identified through those means, there are sanctions that could be applied. I mean, what about banning them from entrance to our countries? Travel bans, confiscating accounts, all of those types of things. I think you could do, because we can find out who some of these fraudsters are, as scam baiters like Jim Browning show. And this isn't kind of a thin bit of evidence. He's got people on the phone with often their CCTV cameras hacked in the control rooms, watching these individuals trying to scam often quite vulnerable older adults in this country and America and elsewhere. So that, there may be issues in terms of using that evidence for a criminal case, but I don't think there's any issues in using that kind of evidence for some kind of sanction of some kind. At least it shows that we're doing something and that there is consequences for those people that in these countries at the moment feel that their chances of being brought to justice in any form are pretty low.
Yeah. And Tammy, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, they go to show that crime does pay, don't they? There's absolutely no deterrent. Like, Mark says, there's no deterrent. There's, no consequences to what they do. It is so easy for, them just to target, and it's not just a problem here in the UK. Like Mark says, it's, Australia, everywhere. I've, recently been, back out in Australia, and everything that we highlight here, they highlight there. You just change a few words. It's tried and tested methods. And why should they change something that works? We need to be able to make a deterrent. We need to, that, they can't benefit from this. But until we do that, how we do that, I don't know.
That was going to be my next question, Tammy. So how do you think policing is going to change, if at all, over the next 5 or 10 years, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think that there has to be more resources. I think that's because fraud isn't going to go away. It may be, slightly in decline the last few years post-COVID, but it's going to stay at a pretty high level. So that there has to be more resources. There has to be more joined up working. I mean, we have obviously a fragmented response, which, our police are designed for traditional crime. It works very well for burglary and local disorder where you have your local police force, but it doesn't work very well for a crime that crosses borders. So I think there needs to be, if you're not going to go down radical solutions of, a national police force, there needs to be means to much closer working together across forces. I think, technology is going to be increasingly important. I mean, the fraudsters will be the first to embrace this, sadly. So ChatGPT, I mean, obviously we're already seeing, Martin Lewis being turned into a kind of, advocate for fraudsters using AI video technology. How long is it before you think you're talking to your son or daughter, but it's actually a fraudster who has, got some images and some voice content and used AI to to mimic that. And so, and particularly, imagine an older adult who's early stage cognitive decline. They think they're talking to their daughter, and their daughter is saying, you need to transfer a load of money into this account. My goodness, it's like it's scary, isn't it? With the technology. Well, the police, I think, are going to have to embrace a lot of these technologies as well. And obviously, a lot of these technologies can be utilised to kind of better prevent, detect, and disrupt forces. So I think technology will be much more central. And one area I hope, and I really hope, that there is much stronger international cooperation and coordination, because that is central to this. As Tammy mentioned, Australia has the same problems as us. These fraudsters are targeting Australians. They are Brits. They're also targeting Americans and Canadians and New Zealanders and South Africans, etc., etc. We should be all working together in, international coordinated units dealing with those same gangs, because it's just a waste of resources if we've got a little pocket of officers in the UK, a little pocket in Australia, and a little pocket in America who aren't working together, but probably looking at the same gangs. And so that's what I hope. Whether that, obviously, these international things are always really hard to achieve for all kinds of reasons. But I would hope that there is like a much stronger cooperation and coordination at that level.
Tammy?
Yeah, I mean, believe it or not, just last week, we have been working with a lady who had a phone call from her daughter. It wasn't her daughter, but it was her daughter's voice, and she was asking her mum to transfer her money for a bill. And mum transferred the money because she said, look, it was my daughter, the way she spoke. So technology is obviously our biggest problem, but surely we can fight technology with technology. We have to be able to, as they weaponize it, we need to try to sort of, sorry to use those words, but, we need to be able to use it to our advantage as well. I think that also we need to really sort of learn where our strengths are, where our weaknesses are, and play to them, and join up more also with telecommunication companies and financial institutions. I always think for us as police, we really can sort of get to understand a victim, understand the psychology behind it, understand why these scammers are so successful, and we need to share this information. The more we all work, I think the way we have to work together, otherwise we're never going to get anywhere with it. And it's, and that's why it is so good to have, so much work done, with academics who really understand the psychology behind it and how language is used. Because for me, for working with victims all the time, to be able to sort of be able to tap into the research they've done, it's really helped me, working with these victims and being able to feed information back as to why something was so successful. When some of us might look at a scam and think, how did someone, get taken in by that? But this grooming process, it is so good, And I think we need to be able to share that kind of information and that work more to try and get a feel for how we can stop things as well.
Yeah. Okay, well, that is all we have time for on this episode. I would like to thank Tammy and Mark for joining me and today to talk about the policing of fraud. And thank you very much, and both of you. My name's Claire Maillet, and this is Fraudible.